One of the many sources of my constant sense of shame and regret is the fact that it took me all the way until my late teens to finally play Ocarina of Time. Although despite missing all of the magic and adventure that would have benefited most from a childlike mindset and least from being walked in on during this. I feel like that gives my perspective on the game as a whole some desperately needed honesty, especially nowadays. Entirely free from nostalgia or excessive burnout, which I've noticed is the biggest issue for most people, constantly replaying it over and over again, desperately trying to astral project their consciousness back to their childhood, only to find that Ocarina of Time is actually just a game, which I'm sure has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that preferring Majora's Mask over it was at one point the unpopular opinion. Look, that's all I'm gonna say. I'm just out here throwing out observations. But I'm also as far removed as physically possible, with this having been my first Zelda game at a time when nothing impressed me anymore, and when the last time I smiled was when someone at school died and I got to go home early. Because and despite all of that, the point being it still hit me. Like my dad. In a lot of ways, it felt like it was made specifically for me. By Miyamoto. Thanks, man. Its world, atmosphere, personality, and how generally off or senseless practically everything is made it instantly one of my favourite games of all time. Until it had all of that brutally crushed out of it in what might as well have been a lively clip from Brazil. The original, however, will still always be there in the form that made it what it is. And while I'd never dare compare it to Majora's Mask, because that's a war zone and I'd rather keep my limbs, in terms of tone and atmosphere though, I think they're more similar than anyone gives them credit for. Sure, Majora's Mask has a constant looming threat to everyone's lives, but Ocarina of Time has that exact thing. Remember? It was like 7 years of genocide. You knee-deep wade through literal corpses at that one point. The only real difference is that to dodge just being an asset flip, they had to change it enough so that it wasn't just a rehash. So they had to change it a lot. Shifting the entire focus of the gameplay from standard level-based progression, although put it like that on the box, you're not selling any copies, to character interaction, collectibles, and a lot more smaller broken up storylines and side quests, but also focusing in on a new gameplay style called not being fun. And putting it like that, it just makes sense that people would be divided over those two styles because everyone's different and it's such an inherently subjective thing. But for me, it's standard level-based progression. Always. Because I'm equally as dull and boring. So to sum that up simply, yeah, it's alright I guess. Every temple in the game that makes up the standard level-based progression are some of the most unique, intimidating, and well-designed environments ever, but even still, none of them come close to standing out and being as memorable as the Forest Temple. To start with, the point at which you reach the temple is where the game actually really starts. The world and its mechanics have been established, you're in on and behind the story with a purpose, and you've been given every main item. But more importantly, you're wearing fucking trousers. Really hate being that guy, but if you want me to take you seriously, that for a start goes a long way. Also, despite the fact it's obviously not, thinking of the Lost Woods as this surreal, infinitely stretching treescape that also just ominously hides the temple in the happy, fun, innocent area the game game started in, like fucking Leonard Lake's cabin, gives the game a huge amount of depth because it feels like it's actually been there forever, covered in mist and being slowly and brutally swallowed by the earth. So it starts to stand out in your mind thinking back to the game even before you really registered all of this properly, especially if you just ran through it quickly or played it over and over again so much that you're now completely numb and blind to good levels. By the way, I am also planning on just leaping over the fact that it's also the best temple in the game in terms of design as well, because early levels in games like this always are. The fewer items you have, the tighter the design tends to be around them, and the more it makes use of what you have and what you know, so it doesn't really count and it feels unfair in that sense, but I still definitely said it anyway. If we're talking about standing out though, the fact that it's really the only unique temple in the game, in that it's the only one that isn't one, that helps a bit with that. It's implied that every other temple, at least at some point, was used as a temple to worship whatever is in the form of these statues or paintings throughout each one, which is usually just the final boss. While the forest temple doesn't, and at least visually looks way more like a fully furnished castle or mansion, yeah, despite being the forest temple, as well as having easily the best looking temple exterior pillars and arch. Alright, that's enough. I kind of have to kill the mood a bit though by admitting the general objective isn't really as exciting as curing the Deku tree or defeating some ancient demon. There's like 4 ghosts. They're taking the flame from those torches and splitting off in different directions, telegraphing that presumably I'd now have to go and find each one, restoring the torches and opening the route to the boss room. Which is fine, but the most pretentious video essayist on earth couldn't draw non-existent lines big enough to find any sense in that. Although what it is a perfect example of that senseless Zelda weirdness, which I'm gonna spin and say is actually a good thing, that if I had to choose is probably my favourite part of all this, specifically though in the form of these fucking things that really get to me because they don't play by established laws. It's a strange thing to just throw up. Even technically now, how they work is just confusing and impressive. Because the best weird, surreal movies and games always have one thing in common. They know exactly when to explain something and when to leave your mind to just tear itself apart trying to justify or make sense of others. Because that way you assume that there always is an explanation, because it explained that, what about this? While on the flip side, overdoing it and never explaining anything is worse, because everything just turns into lol random XD and nothing means anything, so why should I care? So basically it's the perfect balance, exaggerating the strange and creepy aspects by keeping at least some level grounded in a reality with laws. Also seen when Navi drops one of these on you. Wow, just gonna leave me to deal with that, huh? Just gonna let that linger in my mind while walking around in the dark. Thanks. All of it, though, I think contributes to the fact that it's also considered the darkest and eeriest temple, even over the ones that are meant to be scary. I've mentioned the subtle mist and fog already, but the way the lighting bounces perfectly between none, warm candlelight, and blinding undersaturated new metal tier whiteness pushes it in front of every other temple in terms of variety as well, despite all of it being lonely, dark, and spooky. Spiderwebs fill every corner, the eldritch-ass etchings on everything, the frames that are just windows to the void, even though I know are just that, I'm also still equally as certain something's definitely gonna jump out. And then there's also like a tunnel covered in blood. Or is it blood? The remake would have you believe it's paint, so I'd have you believe the remake can shut the fuck up. This is all obviously only my interpretation, and there's no way of proving any of this was actually intended, like how I interpret this block puzzle, as being shit. But the background music alone, accompanied by anything, would have probably made it as memorable, ignoring everything else, because it's probably the most iconic track in Zelda next to the main theme, just because of how strange it is in comparison to everything else. Yeah, that might be because it's relatively short and repetitive, but I'm gonna say it's not that. First of all, like everything else here, it's not trying to be as blatantly creepy, dark, and ominous as the Fire or Shadow Temple's music, in that they're just straight ambient pads under almost random spooky sounds. Because the song has melody and rhythm played on the appropriate forest-themed instruments. There's like a sample of a shaman chant and a rattle, then there's a woodwind flute. I mean, that's probably a flute, right? But it's not playing like one, nothing does. It moves, warps, and twists. Is that a stretch? Yeah. And I always saw it as perfectly mimicking the layout and objective of the temple, having one central area where the ghosts appear, but then spread out and disappear in all directions surrounding you, but still moving around, in the dark, out of sight. Like the sounds, that are drowned in enough reverb and delay to rival the size of each room. Which, in all, is how and why this area really stands out as being one of the best just in video games, because every possible aspect acts like a smaller component of the whole thing, really clicking together and complementing everything else. Again though, I need to stress that's only how I see everything, and I'm sure if you ever approach the devs to comment on any of this, you just get a, oh yeah, you're right, I am a genius. That was all me. And don't worry, the irony in how clearly they did either miss the point entirely or had no idea what genuine good they had is not lost on me. Because, to get really serious for a second, regardless of whether or not I'm one of them, if people want games to start being taken seriously as an art form, they're gonna need to chill out with this shit. Newsflash, a game is its flaws and limitations, and they make up such a huge part of them that the second you start moving stuff around, it becomes an empty, soulless imitation of the original at the very best of times. I mean, imagine adding resolution to something like this. Ah yes, there we go, the definitive version. This is how it was meant to be. This was the artist's true intention had he access to the technology at the time. And an imitation is all it can ever be, because if you're mimicking something, the most you can hope for is to be as good, which never happens anyway, so why? Because if you want to treat games like they can be updated when the technology ceiling rises, have fun winning that battle because you won't. Ever. But yeah, that's just how I feel about that. Wait, what was the point in this again?